Long before the plane lurched into its final, sickening descent, the tension inside the cabin felt strangely off. Something about the stale air, the flickering overhead lights, the way the flight attendants exchanged glances, there was a subtle wrongness that stuck to the back of my throat. I was crammed into a window seat near the wing, half-heartedly flipping through a worn magazine, ignoring the overhead announcements in that perpetually cheerful airline voice. Just another boring flight, I told myself. Another long haul across endless ocean and unnamed jungles, heading toward a place I already forgot. Maybe that was the problem, no sense of purpose, no excitement, only a drifting, grinding sense that something was about to go sideways. They say if you fall from a great enough height, you'll pass out before you hit the ground. They say you might never even feel the impact. I used to believe that. Now I know it's bullshit. We first encountered turbulence about 3 hours into the flight. Nothing major, just enough to make a few overhead compartments rattle. The seatbelt sign pinged on. Most people groaned, put away their laptops, let the flight attendant scurry around with calm reassurance. Then came the second jolt, much stronger. The plane dropped at least 50 feet in an instant, sending drinks flying, followed by a chorus of panicked yelps. The pilot's voice crackled through the PA, sounding more tense than reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We've encountered unexpected," and then the plane tilted, the kind of tilt that pinned me against the window so hard I thought the glass might crack under my shoulder. I saw it then, through that same window, flames licking from the engine on the wing. Or maybe not flames exactly, but a sudden burst of sparks, black smoke pouring out in a thick, oily plume. My brain stuttered with disbelief. Planes don't just spontaneously catch fire mid-flight. Not in the real world, anyway. But it was happening, real as the terrified screams around me. The cabin lights flickered again, and the oxygen masks dropped in a flurry of plastic and tangled tubes. A half-second later, everything flipped as the fuselage jolted with such force that anyone still standing was thrown violently. The overhead panels tore open. Luggage pelted people below like artillery. Chaos. Pure, mindless chaos. In the swirl of madness, I remember the weirdest details. A child's stuffed toy soared overhead in slow motion. Some lady across the aisle was vomiting, the bile suspended in midair before splattering onto the seat in front of her. I heard cursing in multiple languages, sharp cries of prayer, frantic sobs. Then the plane bucked again, and this time the floor seemed to fall away entirely, as if we'd been shoved off a cliff. My stomach lurched into my throat. Gravity hammered me into the seat, and I fumbled for the oxygen mask. When I finally got it over my nose and mouth, my breath came in wet, panic gasps. An alarm blared somewhere overhead, a shrill, mind-melting beep. The loudspeakers crackled once more, but only static emerged. Outside the window, glimpses of impossibly green canopy appeared. Jungle. We were losing altitude fast. We had no angle to glide, no runway in sight, just an endless expanse of dense forest rising up to meet us. I remember thinking, we can't possibly land safely here, the pilot can't see a damn thing, we're going to smash into treetops at hundreds of miles per hour. We did. The first impact was a violent scrape against the tops of gigantic trees. Branches and foliage shredded the underbelly of the plane, the shrieking of metal on wood blending with the roars of terrified passengers. The lights went out completely, replaced by strobing flashes from short-circuiting panels. Then came the final, full collision. The plane slammed into the jungle floor, skidding, flipping, snapping in half with a thunderous groan of tearing steel. I blacked out on impact. Maybe it was the whiplash or my head striking the seat in front of me, or maybe my mind just couldn't handle the terror. When I came to, it was evening, dim, red light filtering through ragged holes in the fuselage. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not total silence, but a suffocating hush broken only by the sizzling crackle of small fires, the drip of leaking fluids, and the groaning of twisted metal. Dazed, I tried to move. My seatbelt still held me in place, the strap digging into my chest. My left ankle was pinned under something heavy. The smell was a nauseating cocktail, burnt rubber, spilled fuel, and a coppery tang of blood so thick I could taste it in the air. My own blood, maybe, or someone else's. My head throbbed. I reached up and felt a warm slickness on my scalp. I was bleeding, but not profusely. Not enough to kill me yet. Blinking to clear my vision, I looked around the cabin, what was left of it. Rows of seats had crumpled forward. Parts of the fuselage overhead had peeled away like the lid of a sardine can, letting in the last feeble rays of the sun. Corpses hung from their seats, limbs contorted. Some people had been thrown clear of the plane altogether. I heard faint whimpers, moans, and somewhere a strangled cry for help. The entire tail section was gone, ripped off who knows where. I braced myself, unbuckled, and tried to stand. Pain lanced through my ankle as I pushed whatever had pinned it. A chunk of overhead bin? Possibly. With a grunt, I heaved it aside, biting back a scream as I freed my foot. I tested weight on it, sprained, maybe broken, but I could move. One step at a time. One breath at a time. Hello? I croaked. My voice echoed in the battered space. Anyone? A few seats away, a woman stirred. Her hair was matted to the side of her face with drying blood, and her eyes flickered in my direction. She tried to speak, coughed. I limped toward her, climbing over debris and bodies. When I reached her, I saw the shard of metal that had impaled her through the abdomen. A piece of the plane's interior, maybe. My stomach twisted at the sight. I could see the edges of the wound, red and wet, soaking her shirt. She whispered something, a rasp I couldn't catch. I leaned closer. Water, she managed, tears mixing with the blood on her cheeks. I looked around, mind racing. Water. I had nothing. Everything was scattered, destroyed. The flight attendant station up front, maybe there'd be bottled water. But I had no guarantee. She coughed wetly again, her breath rattling. Even if I found water, that wound looked fatal. I'll be back, I said, pressing her hand gently, though it felt like a lie. She closed her eyes, as if letting me go was her only option. Wincing, I hauled myself up the tilted aisle, stepping over torn seats, shards of plastic, and shattered glass. The overhead compartments mostly lay on the ground now, crushed. Occasionally I heard a short hiss from severed oxygen lines or the pop of tiny flare-ups as bits of smoldering fabric tried to catch. My foot slipped on something. I looked down to see a severed hand, palm up, almost offering itself. My stomach lurched, but I swallowed the bile. Focus. Keep going. Past the first-class bulkhead, I found the remains of the flight galley. The cabinet doors had burst open, strewing meal trays and utensils. Some of the beverage carts were jammed in twisted metal frames. I spotted a few intact plastic bottles among the wreckage, gleaming with the last light. Hobbling over, I snatched them up. 2 were empty, cracked open, but 3 remained sealed. Water. Clutching them, I started back. The woman had died in the short time I was gone, eyes glassy, staring at nothing. I pressed my fingers to her neck. No pulse. Another life snuffed in this metal coffin. Gently, I laid one of the water bottles on her chest, some irrational gesture of respect or apology. Then I swallowed hard and kept moving. I needed to find other survivors. I found only one more conscious person in the wreckage, a middle-aged man pinned under a collapsed row of seats near the cockpit area. His face was slick with sweat, and he whimpered when I approached, eyes wild. "I can't feel my legs," he said, voice trembling. That was no surprise. The seats had crushed his lower body. An ugly piece of metal jutted from the side of his thigh. With what little medical knowledge I had, I tried to see if I could shift the seats. But they were wedged, all twisted up with the floor. Even with both arms, I couldn't budge them an inch. He grabbed my wrist, desperate. "Please, don't leave me. I'm alive. I'm alive." I gave him some water, lifting it to his lips. He choked a bit, but managed to swallow. "I'll try to find help," I said. "Rescue teams, maybe. Just hold on, all right?" He nodded, tears streaming, though we both knew how slim the chances were. Still, I had to try. I limped toward the cockpit. Maybe there was a working radio or an emergency beacon. But the door was practically melted into its frame, everything inside crushed. The pilot and co-pilot were mere lumps in their seats, unrecognizable. The instruments were dark. A trickle of fuel dripped from above, forming a puddle by my feet. The stench was overpowering. Outside. I had to get outside. If we were in the jungle, maybe the fuselage was no place to stay. Fire risk, structural collapse, or even predators. My ankle howled in pain with every step, but adrenaline pushed me on. At the plane's ripped open side, I climbed over a crumpled edge of metal and dropped into a tangle of vines and mud. The outside world slammed into my senses, choking humidity, the buzz of insects, the heavy scent of wet leaves and decaying vegetation. The plane had carved a long scar through the trees, flattening a corridor of destruction. Smoke rose in lazy coils from pieces of scattered wreckage. Bodies, or body parts, hung from branches or lay among the snapped trunks. My stomach churned. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to stifle a horrified moan. Somewhere behind me, the pinned man screamed. A sharp, guttural wail that sent birds flapping from the treetops in alarm. I turned, seeing him half visible through the twisted remains. He reached out, his voice ragged. "It's on me. Something's on me." My heart hammered. I scrambled back inside to see what was happening. In the dim light, I saw movement near his pinned legs, something dark, elongated, sliding around the wreckage. For a moment, my mind refused to register. Then it clicked, a massive snake, coiled partially around the seat frames, its tail flicking. The man flailed, arms beating against it. The snake's head reared up, hooded. A viper? Cobra? I didn't know snakes well, but it was large, easily 8 or 9 feet long, thick-bodied. He howled as the snake struck, fangs sinking into his thigh. Helpless, pinned, all he could do was scream. I lurched forward, swinging my fist at the serpent's body. My blow glanced off its slick scales. It uncoiled in a flash, releasing his leg and hissing at me, head swaying. My heart pounded, but I grabbed a piece of metal debris and lashed out again, connecting with the side of its skull this time. The snake shuddered, then slithered away into the darkness beyond the broken hull, leaving me panting, adrenaline surging. The man moaned, eyes rolling back, foam collecting at the corners of his mouth. Snake venom, or shock, or both. I tried to reassure him, hang on, but his breathing turned shallow. He clutched at my shirt. I had nothing to treat a venomous bite. Within minutes, his grip slackened, and he went still. Darkness fully descended outside, leaving the wreck interior in near blackness except for the flicker of distant flames. I was alone. Maybe truly alone. I collapsed onto a partly intact seat, mind reeling. No rescue in sight, no idea where we had crashed. We could be hundreds of miles from any settlement. The radio was useless, the plane shredded, survivors either dead or dying. I told myself to stay calm. The immediate dangers, injuries, lack of supplies, the looming possibility of more predators. I needed a plan. My ankle hurt like hell, and I was bleeding from a gash on my forearm. My head pounded. But if I just sat here, I'd die of dehydration or infection, or get eaten by some jungle creature. I rummaged through overhead compartments, under seats, finding scraps, a half-crushed first aid kit missing half its contents, a single working flashlight, a roll of duct tape. A couple of energy bars from the airline snack tray. Not enough for more than a day or two. I also found a short length of rope, maybe from someone's carry-on. I stashed it all in a battered backpack I found beneath a seat. The plane floor was slick with blood, so I tried not to look too closely as I stepped. At some point, I realized I needed to sleep, or at least rest, but every nerve in me screamed that sleeping here was suicidal. The snake was just one threat. The stench of blood could attract predators. But there was nowhere else. I dragged a few seat cushions together, forming a little corner near the front. My plan: wedge myself in, keep the flashlight handy, trying not to pass out completely. The moaning had stopped, replaced by the endless drone of insects. My eyelids felt like lead. I drifted, jolting awake at every small sound. Once, I heard a rustling near the fuselage gap. I raised the flashlight, shining it out into the night. Nothing, just waving leaves, a suggestion of shapes in the gloom. Another time, something scuttled across my foot in the darkness. I kicked frantically, hearing it skitter away. Possibly a spider or a giant cockroach. My heart hammered, but exhaustion dragged me under again. When dawn broke, pale light revealed the full horror. Now I could see all the bodies around me, twisted in their seats or spilled onto the floor. Broken faces, vacant eyes, pinkish entrails glistening through torn clothing. The smell was indescribable. I forced myself to keep down the surge of vomit. I had to get out. Outside, the morning sun scorched the air into a humid blanket that plastered my clothes to my skin. The crashed plane looked like a fallen titan amid the swaying green. A piece of the wing jutted from the ground at an odd angle, still smoking from the ruined engine. Further along the wreckage trail, I saw the tail section jammed upright in the trees, as though stabbed into them. Suitcases and random debris littered the area. In daylight, I decided to search for more supplies. If there was an emergency kit, flares, or a beacon, they might be in the tail or cockpit. The cockpit was unsalvageable, crushed and half buried. That left the tail. Gathering my courage, I started along the wreckage path, each step an agony on my ankle. I clutched a metal rod as a makeshift cane, scanning the ground for snakes. I passed bodies flung into the foliage, some missing limbs, some halfway devoured by insects overnight. Flies buzzed in deafening swarms, a living carpet on the corpses' wounds. My chest tightened with each horrifying sight. Still, I pressed on. When I reached the tail, I found it perched precariously in a tangle of branches about 10 feet above the ground. Could I climb? Maybe. The metal was torn and jagged. I circled the area until I found a vantage point, an upended trunk I could possibly scramble onto, then grabbed the rim of the tail's open wound. Sweat poured down my face as I hoisted myself up. My ankle screamed in protest, and I slipped once, slicing my palm on sharp metal. Blood welled, but I gritted my teeth. Finally, I managed to get inside the tail section. It was upside down relative to normal orientation, so seats were above my head, overhead bins below my feet. Everything was soaked with rain or dew. I found a panel marked emergency. Forcing it open, I discovered a deflated raft, a few flares, a battered med kit, some water pouches, and a small plastic container that read signal transmitter. My heart soared. If I could get that transmitter working, maybe rescue wasn't impossible. As I wrestled with the container, a sudden crack made me freeze. The tail section shifted, one of the branches supporting it snapped. I felt gravity tilt as the entire hunk of metal began to slide. My eyes darted to the opening. No time to climb out carefully. I jumped, cradling the container to my chest. I landed on my bad ankle, collapsing with a cry of pain. The tail crashed down a second later, slamming into the ground in a thunder of twisted metal and splintered wood. A chunk of debris whipped past my head, missing by inches. Panting, I rolled over, relief battling with the throbbing in my leg. At least I had the transmitter. Let it be intact, please. I crawled away from the fallen tail, rummaging in the container to see what I'd actually retrieved. The signal device was there, cracked but maybe functional. A small battery pack. Instructions said something about setting it up in an open area. The flares were soaked but hopefully usable. The med kit had bandages, antiseptic, even a scalpel. A real treasure trove. Pulling myself up, I hobbled back toward the plane. My hope, I'd find a patch of clear ground to set up the transmitter. The instructions indicated it might work even under some canopy if the signal was strong enough, but open air was best. The idea of rescue flooded me with shaky optimism. But the jungle had other ideas. About halfway back, I heard that wet dragging sound again, the same noise from the prior night. I froze, scanning the thick undergrowth. Tall palms and vines formed a wall of green, but something moved behind them. Then I saw it, a shape, hunched and wrong, large enough to be a jaguar, or even bigger. My breath caught in my throat. Maybe it was a big cat, maybe a bear if such creatures roamed these jungles. But then it shifted, and I caught a glimpse of an elongated muzzle, spines or quills along its back. This wasn't something I recognized from any nature documentary. My heart hammered. My rational mind insisted it had to be a known animal. Then it let out a guttural huff, and the stench hit me, a foul, rancid odor like rotting meat and bile. In a burst of adrenaline, I lurched forward, ignoring my ankle. I ran for the plain, hearing it crashing through the brush behind me. Trees shook, branches snapped. Whatever it was big and not shy about noise. I stumbled into the clearing around the plain, half expecting it to burst out and smash me. But the sound stopped at the edge of the foliage, as if it refused to enter the open wreck site. Or maybe it was just circling. I felt eyes on me, a primal sense of being hunted. My chest heaved with ragged breaths. I retreated into the fuselage, clutching the container. My mind raced, set up the transmitter? I needed a clearing, but that creature might be out there. Do I wait here, try to defend myself? Or slip away quietly to some vantage point? As I wrestled with indecision, a new horror intruded. An insect swarm, drawn by the smell of decay, had begun to fill the plain, their droning wings a constant hum. I realized I couldn't stay inside the wreck for long, or I'd be overrun by flies, maggots, and possibly bigger scavengers. I needed to act. Checking the transmitter's instructions again, I saw it had an internal battery that had to be charged by a small hand crank, then the antenna extended. The device was battered, but maybe workable. Right outside the plane, a partial clearing existed where the wings had sheared off some trees. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I gathered my courage. If that creature wanted me, it would come anyway. So, I limped out, scanning the tree line with every step. The presence, or the memory of it, loomed. I heard faint rustling, but maybe it was just wind. I placed the transmitter on a rock, extended its antenna, and began turning the crank. It clicked, a feeble whir that suggested some internal mechanism. 5 minutes of cranking gave me a small green LED light. Maybe it was enough to broadcast a basic distress signal. When I flipped the switch, a faint beep sounded. Then static from a tiny speaker. The manual said the broadcast was automatic, sending an SOS ping on multiple frequencies. I could only hope someone might be listening. As I stepped back, satisfied, the undergrowth parted. My blood ran cold. A shape emerged into the clearing. It was 7 or 8 feet long, low to the ground, blackish scales or fur matted with filth. It sniffed the air, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Eyes reflective in the sunlight, almost milky. This thing was real, not a hallucination. Not a standard jungle predator, either. Some hideous freak of nature or an undiscovered species. It advanced slowly, nostrils flaring, tasting the air. I backed away, heart pounding in my ears. My hand found the handle of a hatchet I'd salvaged from a maintenance box earlier, the flight axe. Another emergency tool. I held it up, though I doubted I could do more than piss it off. The creature let out a rasping growl, thick drool hanging from its jaws. I realized it smelled the blood from the plane. Maybe from me as well. Predatory hunger radiated from its every movement. My breath caught in a trembling gasp. Without warning, it lunged, crossing the distance in a blur. I swung the hatchet with all my strength. The blade connected with its shoulder, a wet thunk. It screeched, a sound that stabbed my ears, but momentum knocked me down. My ankle twisted, sending jolts of pain up my leg. The hatchet was wrenched from my grip as the creature thrashed, blackish blood splattering. On my back, I saw its jaws gape wide, about to snap onto me. My hand scrabbled for anything, a rock, debris. My fingers closed around a broken seat bracket, jagged metal at one end. I drove it upward into the creature's neck. A sickening crunch, a spurt of vile-smelling fluid. The beast howled, convulsing, but still fighting, its claws raking my side. I screamed in agony, forcing the bracket deeper until it found something vital. At last, the creature collapsed, half on top of me, spasming. I gagged at the reek of its breath, barely managing to roll it off. My side burned from claw wounds, but I was alive. My vision swam. I tasted blood, maybe my own. Crawling away, I tried to stand, tried to see if it was truly dead. It lay twitching, mouth opening and closing in silent gasps. Then it stilled. I stared, shaking, tears mingling with sweat. My entire body was battered. The transmitter beeped on its rock, a lonely SOS call in a jungle that felt more alien than Earth. I sank to my knees, pressing my hand to my bleeding side. I'd just fought some monstrous predator that shouldn't exist. What next? I didn't have an answer. I only knew that each moment was a new battle, and rescue felt 1,000 miles away. Blood seeped through my shirt, warm and sticky, as I staggered back toward the gutted remains of the fuselage. My breath came in ragged gasps, adrenaline still roaring through my veins. That nightmarish creature lay motionless behind me, a dark smear of alien biology on the jungle floor. I refused to look over my shoulder again. Every nerve demanded I keep eyes forward, find shelter, and attempt to stanch the bleeding. The idea that I'd just killed something so unnatural unsettled me deeply. This was no simple jaguar or boar. Its head shape, the ridges of bone or cartilage along its spine, these things defied all the usual categories of wildlife. But the jungle is vast, harboring secrets that rarely see the light of day. Perhaps I'd stumbled upon one of them. Whether it was unique or part of a hidden species, I couldn't dwell on it. I had to survive the next hour. The transmitter beeped faintly from its perch on the rock, sending out signals that might or might not reach the outside world. If rescue came, it wouldn't be instantaneous. I needed to fortify my position or move somewhere safer. When I reached the ragged opening in the plane's fuselage, my strength gave out, and I half collapsed over the threshold. The interior was sweltering, the morning's light had shifted, beating down on the torn metal and raising the temperature inside like an oven. The smell of decomposition intensified with each passing hour, but rummaging among the wreckage was still my best chance for supplies. I used the battered med kit from the tail to treat my wounds, ripped clothing, fresh antiseptic, more bandages than I could afford to squander. My side had 3 parallel claw marks, each dangerously deep. If infection set in, I'd be in serious trouble. But I had no choice. Biting down on a shredded piece of cushion to muffle my groans, I poured antiseptic on the claw wounds. It felt like molten steel on my flesh. My ankle had swollen to nearly double its normal size, deep purple along the bone. I couldn't put much weight on it, so I scavenged a makeshift splint using a bent tray table and some duct tape. Crude, but it would keep my foot from moving too much. Checking my forearm, where I'd cut it climbing the tail, I found the gash fairly shallow, though nasty. Another bandage, more antiseptic. When I finished, my head spun with exhaustion and pain. But rest was a luxury. I eyed the interior, scanning for anything I might have missed: seat cushions, wire, a bottle of half-spilled liquor from the cabin service cart, some shattered glass from a window. If I was stuck here another night, I needed water and some kind of defensive plan. I rummaged deeper, ignoring the bodies as best I could. Guilt gnawed at me, but I was beyond squeamishness now. I found a half-ruined flight attendant satchel with random items, a small lead flashlight, hair ties, a single protein bar, a handful of nuts in a sealed bag, and, most importantly, a cigarette lighter. My chest fluttered with relief. Fire was everything out here. In the overhead bin area, what was left of it, I discovered a rolled-up blanket, partially scorched. This might be crucial for warmth if the temperature dropped at night or for carrying items. I also found a handful of seat belts I could cut free. Their straps might be used for tying splints or fashioning a harness. Amid the chaos, I spotted something that made my heart skip, a compact survival knife tucked under a seat, probably from someone's carry-on. It was sheathed in black nylon, the blade a few inches long, serrated on one side. That was a far cry better than swinging a random chunk of metal. I clutched it like a lifeline, my new best friend in this green hell. Time felt elastic, hours dragging, yet the day's light racing across the sky. The sun was sinking again before I realized how late it was. I had to decide, stay in the plane for the night, or relocate to the partial clearing near the transmitter. Both had drawbacks. The plane reeked of death, attracting scavengers. The clearing was wide open, with little shelter. Then there was the matter of that monstrous creature, presumably a lone predator, though how could I be certain? Ultimately, I chose a spot just outside the plane, where the fuselage's curved side offered a bit of a wall to my back, and some partial overhead from a piece of torn wing leaning against it. I spent the waning daylight dragging debris around, erecting a makeshift barricade of twisted seats and scraps of metal to form a defensive perimeter. If something tried to rush me, it wouldn't be quiet or easy. The ground was spongy with decaying leaves. I flattened a space, laid down the scorched blanket, propped up a seat cushion to serve as a pillow. I placed the transmitter in plain sight a short distance away, its tiny LED still blinking hopefully. Then I gathered some fallen branches and used the lighter to start a small fire, feeding it with bits of seat foam and dry leaves. The thick smoke stank of chemicals, but the flames gave me a sense of safety. Many predators loathe fire. Or at least that's what I told myself. As twilight deepened, the jungle came alive with its orchestra of croaks and chirps and unseen scuttling. Mosquitoes descended in a cloud, biting every inch of exposed skin. I cursed and used more of my precious antiseptic wipes as a repellent. The heat of the fire helped ward off some insects, but not enough. My injuries burned. I felt weak, hungry, but forced down what meager scraps I had, the nuts, half the protein bar, and some water from the plane supply. I was rationing carefully, rescue might come tomorrow, or not. Each swallow tasted of plastic and dread. Darkness swallowed the world. The only light came from the flickering fire and the faint glow of instrument panels inside the wreck, some battered battery backups failing sporadically. The hush between the nightly insect calls was unnerving. Every rustle in the foliage made me tighten my grip on the survival knife. The events of the day replayed in my mind, the crash, the pinned survivors, that monstrous beast. My soul felt scraped raw by fear. I must have dozed. A shriek tore me awake, a high, primal cry echoing through the trees. My heart hammered as I jerked upright, disoriented. The fire was low, just glowing embers. I could see little beyond the dancing shadows. Another scream, agony, terror, and a bestial undertone. It came from the direction of the crashed tail, maybe a few hundred yards away. The jungle canopy muffled it, making it impossible to tell if it was human or animal. But it chilled me to the marrow. Something was out there, possibly something else unnatural, or an injured creature wailing in the night. My breath came in ragged gasps. I added more fuel to the fire, coaxing the flames higher. The screaming recurred twice more, each time diminishing in volume, as if retreating deeper into the darkness. Eventually, silence reigned again, leaving me a trembling mess. My wounds pulsed with each frantic heartbeat. I clutched the knife until dawn's first grey light seeped through the branches. I'd barely rested. My body screamed for real sleep, but survival wouldn't allow it. Daylight at least made me feel less vulnerable, though the dangers hardly diminished. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I set about the next priority, water. The supply from the plane wouldn't last forever, especially in this sweltering heat. I recalled glimpsing a trickle of water somewhere along the wreck's path. If I could find a small stream or puddle, I might refill. With a container and a way to boil it, I could manage safe drinking water. I rummaged the plane again for something metal to use as a pot. Eventually, I uncovered a crumpled stainless steel serving container from the galley. It was bent but could hold a couple of cups of liquid. That plus the lighter might let me purify water. My plan, gather water, return, boil it over the fire. Armed with the survival knife at my side, the hatchet from the maintenance box, and my splintered ankle, I set out. My path was a careful hobble through the chaotic debris field. Each step was a new battle against the throbbing in my foot. I found the water source about a quarter-mile away, a small rivulet trickling down a rocky slope, forming a shallow pool before seeping into the earth. Around it, the vegetation was thick, vines draping over half-submerged boulders. I tested the water's clarity with the tip of my finger. It smelled fresh enough, not stagnant. While I knelt to collect some in a salvaged plastic bottle, a wave of nauseating dizziness swept me. Fever, I realized. My wounds might be infected, or I was simply dehydrated. Spots danced in my vision. I steadied myself, took a desperate sip. It tasted earthy, slightly metallic. Safe or not, my thirst was too great to ignore. Movement flickered in the corner of my eye. I froze, scanning the vine-choked clearing. Nothing. Probably an animal scurrying away. My nerves were on a razor's edge. I forced myself to fill the bottle, fill the container, then hobble back. On the way, I heard a buzzing cloud of flies in the distance. Following the sound, I nearly retched when I saw the remains of that bizarre creature from the day before. It was half-eaten, torn open from the belly up, maggots writhing in the exposed flesh. Another predator, or scavengers, had found it in the night. The stench smacked me in the face, and I stumbled away, heart pounding. Whatever had feasted on that beast might be prowling nearby. I made it back to my makeshift camp by midday, drenched in sweat and trembling from intermittent chills. My side's claw marks were red, puffy, seeping. I had to clean them again. But first, water. I lit the fire anew, placed the container on it, and let the water boil. The small container only held so much, so I repeated the process multiple times until I had a few bottles of boiled water. Not crystal clear, but safer than nothing. Thirst overcame caution. I drank greedily, ignoring the heat. My parched throat welcomed the lukewarm water. Some dribbled down my chin, mingling with the grime and dried blood that seemed permanently caked on me. My next move, treat infection. The med kit from the tail had a small stash of antibiotic pills, just a few. I swallowed 2, hoping to stave off the worst. Using leftover bandages, I redressed my wounds with newly boiled water, though I had no antiseptic left. The deeper claw cuts worried me. They looked angry, flesh around them turning dark and inflamed. Fighting panic, I forced myself to think, if help was coming, they'd likely arrive by helicopter or plane. I had a transmitter, a clearing. If the signal was being broadcast, someone might pick it up. But time was a problem, my body was failing. A new noise caught my attention, an engine? I scrambled up, nearly falling in the process. Yes, a faint droning above the treetops. My heart soared. I stumbled out of the fuselage shadow into the clearing, scanning the sky. There, a speck passing overhead, high and fast. I waved my arms like a madman, even though they likely couldn't see me through the dense canopy. Then I remembered the flares. They were inside the tail kit. I fumbled one out, yanked the cap, and ignited it. A brilliant red smoke poured out, swirling upwards. I prayed it would reach above the canopy. But the plane overhead grew quieter, smaller, disappearing. The smoke billowed for half a minute, then died. No sign the aircraft had noticed. I sank to my knees, the flare canister still hissing faintly. The heartbreak was almost too much to bear. I let out a ragged sob, alone in the unfeeling wilderness. Nevertheless, the possibility of rescue was real. Another plane might pass closer, or a helicopter. I decided to keep a flare always at arm's reach, in case. The next 3 days, or what felt like 3 days, I lost exact track, were a grinding ordeal. My routine consisted of gathering water, boiling it, trying to eat random bits of salvaged food. I scoured the plane for anything not yet spoiled, tiny bags of peanuts, crackers, a few miniature liquor bottles. The latter served to disinfect minor cuts, though I also sipped them to dull the pain. Each night, the jungle tested my defenses. I heard creatures prowling, so I shined beyond the fire. Smaller beasts, or the same species as the thing I'd killed? I didn't know. I erected more barricades, sharpened a few metal rods for spears. My infected wounds worsened. Fever crept higher, making me delirious at times. I had nightmares of the plane crash repeating, only in slow motion, with the monstrous creature in the pilot's seat, cackling as it dove into the trees. I'd wake drenched in sweat, half certain I heard distant laughter in the forest. On what I guessed was the fourth day post-crash, I awoke to a thunderous sky. A storm was rolling in, dark clouds blotting out the sun. Wind whipped through the clearing, rattling debris. Rain started in sheets, pounding the plane's hull and turning the ground into mud. My fire sputtered and died. Trying to relight anything in this downpour was impossible. I retreated under a piece of wing with my blanket wrapped around me, shivering despite the humid air. The storm raged for hours, lightning cracking overhead. Rain battered the jungle so hard that rivulets of water washed through my camp, sweeping away small objects. At least I could collect fresh water, I thought bitterly. I set out every container I could find. The thunderclaps vibrated in my chest, each flash of lightning revealing silhouettes of leaning trees. Once, in the flicker, I saw a massive shape perched on a fallen log, watching me, some four-legged predator. My heart froze, but the lightning vanished, and in the next flash, it was gone. When the storm finally passed, night had already fallen. The clearing was a swampy mess. My barricades remained, but were partially collapsed by the torrent. The transmitter was soaked, blinking weakly. I tapped it, not sure if it still functioned. I spent that night in a state of delirium. My fever spiked, possibly from the exertion in the rain. At times, I saw shapes drifting around me in the darkness, my dead fellow passengers, their faces slack, eyes empty, beckoning me to join them. I mumbled apologies. I heard the pinned man's voice, "Don't leave me." The words echoed until I didn't know if they were real or hallucinated. My body burned with infection. Sometime after midnight, I snapped awake to a new sound, footsteps sloshing in the mud. Heavy, purposeful. Not a slinking predator. My heart pounded. I grabbed the survival knife. A flashlight flickered across the wreckage. Yes, a flashlight. "Hey!" I croaked, voice cracking. "I'm here." The light swung toward me, blinding. I raised a hand. Relief flooded me, thinking rescue had arrived. Then, a coarse voice hissed something I didn't understand, a language or dialect foreign to me. Dark figures moved closer. They weren't wearing rescue uniforms, they had ragged clothes, some with bandanas, others with well-worn gear. One carried a rifle strapped over his shoulder. My sense of relief faltered. Who were these people? Local rebels? Poachers? Smugglers? This region might be rife with dangerous groups. I tried to speak anyway, plane crash survivors. One man stepped forward, eyes cold. He spoke rapidly in a language I didn't catch, then broken English, "You alone?" My adrenaline spiked. My mouth opened, but words tangled. They saw my condition, filthy, feverish, clutching a knife. One snorted in derision. Another jabbered in his own tongue, gesturing at the plane. They advanced, rummaging through the debris, ignoring my attempts to talk. I realized with mounting dread they were scavengers, looters. This wreck might be a source of valuables, electronics, luggage, anything salvageable. I was just another piece of wreckage to them. I tried again, "Help. I need medical." The man with the rifle barked a command. Another man lunged, grabbing my wrist, forcing me to drop the knife. I yelped. They pinned me against a broken seat, rifling through my pockets. My heart hammered. Would they kill me for any valuables? I had none. They found the small flashlight, the leftover antibiotic pills, even the half bottle of water I'd stored. They confiscated everything. I tried to protest, but a punch to my gut silenced me, white-hot pain lancing through my wounds. Tears of frustration welled. These men were no saviors. They were opportunists, picking a crashed plane clean. The largest one, with a machete across his back, surveyed me like a vulture. In broken English, he sneered, "You, soldier? Tourist? Just passenger. Please, sick. Help me," I gasped. He spat on the ground, a contemptuous gesture. Then they resumed looting. One discovered the transmitter, exclaimed in excitement. Another found the flares. My stomach churned. If they took that transmitter, any hope of rescue vanished. I summoned courage and tried to grab it. Instantly, the rifle butt slammed into my temple. My world spun. I tasted blood. The machete man barked a laugh, brandishing the transmitter. My vision blurred, but I saw them rummaging further inside the plane, collecting anything of value. They paid no heed to my groans or the blood trickling down my face. After several minutes of rummaging, they started conversing in low tones. Then the machete man stepped up to me, grabbed my jaw, and forced my head up. "You stay." "We go," he said, a mocking grin exposing stained teeth. He pointed to the plane, then at me, then at his men. "No rescue. You could die." He shoved me back into the mud. My splintered ankle seared with agony. Another man flicked on my own flashlight, shining it directly at my eyes, snickering. The group gathered their loot, my transmitter, flares, a bag of random items. Then, without a backward glance, they left. Their flashlights bobbed away into the darkness, the only evidence of civilization for miles. I lay there, stunned, tears mingling with the mud. They had taken everything, my precious meds, my water, even my chance at sending an SOS. The feeble blinking of the transmitter was gone. I was alone again, stripped of nearly all resources, beaten, feverish, left to the mercy of the jungle. Dark thoughts welled inside me. For a moment, I considered letting the infection take me, drifting into oblivion. But some stubborn kernel of will refused to die. Gasping, I crawled back under the wing. The storm's aftermath had left everything soaked, my small stash of leftover seat cushions drenched. The fire was out, drowned in the mud. By the faint moonlight, I saw my reflection in a puddle, my face bruised, swollen, streaked with blood. I recognized no one. Just a victim. Maybe that was all I was now. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted, startling me. Then came rustling in the undergrowth, as if to remind me I wasn't truly alone. The wilderness teemed with life that owed me nothing. I forced myself onto my side, curling up to retain body heat. I would survive the night, somehow. In restless semi-consciousness, the pinned man's voice returned to me, "Don't leave me. I'm alive. I'm alive," I moaned, pressing my hands to my ears. I couldn't stop the barrage of memories. The crunch of the snake's fangs, the woman with the shard of metal in her belly, the horrifying roars of that monster I'd killed. And now these scavengers, humans more monstrous in some ways. I drifted into darkness again, coughed up bile, drifted deeper. Fever made me see shifting shapes at the edge of vision, shadows with eyes, the crashed plane groaning like a dying beast, each rivet a nerve. Then a new day dawned, grey light creeping over the horizon. My body felt like lead, every joint stiff. My left arm burned from shoulder to elbow. My ankle was a throbbing mass of pain. My side was clammy with dried blood. My mouth was parched, thirst stabbing me awake. No transmitter. No flares. My precious antibiotics gone. The water containers? Possibly they left me one by accident. I crawled about, rummaging in the debris. At last, I found a single plastic bottle, half full, hidden under a collapsed seat. I gulped half of it, then forced myself to save the rest. I had to find a new water source. The day stretched before me, each second a mountain to climb. My infected wounds weren't improving, and the swelling around the claw marks was a terrifying sign of sepsis. If I had no antibiotics, I needed to treat it somehow. People say certain plants in the jungle can help. But I was no botanist. An idea took root, maybe the scavengers had a camp nearby. If I could track them, maybe I could steal back the transmitter or at least find a better path out. It was desperate, borderline suicidal. But waiting here meant slow death. I recalled the direction they vanished. I also recalled the storm-churned mud might preserve footprints. Hobbling around the perimeter of the clearing, I found them indeed, a trail of boot prints heading north, deeper into the jungle. Following them wouldn't be easy, especially with my injuries. But any direction was better than rotting here. I assembled a minimal kit, the survival knife. They hadn't bothered searching for it again after knocking it out of my hand, a length of seatbelt strap, the battered metal container to boil water, the half bottle, and a chunk of salvage for a makeshift crutch. If I was going to do this, I had to do it now, before infection crippled me. Pushing aside dread, I limped into the green unknown, the footprints my only guide. Every step was an exercise in pain management. The humidity closed in, insects swarmed my head, and the thick canopy let only speckled sunlight through. What lay ahead? Bandits with guns, monstrous beasts, or a slow death from fever? A lesser part of me screamed to go back to the plane, cling to the hope of rescue. But the plane was no shelter anymore. Survival is momentum, I told myself. Keep moving, or succumb. So I moved, deeper into the jungle's maw, each step echoing with the harsh rasp of my breath, each heartbeat a countdown to some unknown fate. The sun hung low in the sky by the time I realized how badly I'd underestimated the jungle's depths. Each yard gained was a fight against tangling vines and creeping, ankle-snaring roots. Sharp-edged leaves left shallow cuts on my arms and cheeks, stinging insects launched kamikaze attacks every time my sweat-soaked clothes brushed their nests. But the footprints remained visible in the churned-up mud, evidence of the scavengers who robbed me. I kept telling myself there was a rational reason to follow them. They stole the transmitter. If I wanted any real shot at rescue, I needed to get the device back or at least find some clue about how they escaped this green hell. But something deeper, rawer drove me, anger. They'd beaten me when I was already half dead, stripped away my last hope. Now my fury burned hotter than my fever, a reckless push in my exhausted body. Sweat dripped into my eyes, mingling with the grime caking my brow. My side flared with constant pain, each step jarring the infected claw marks. The seatbelt strap crutch I used sank into the spongy earth. More than once, I nearly toppled, wooziness threatening to drag me down for good. Yet I pressed on, scanning for signs of passage, a snapped twig, a scuffed patch of moss, a broken palm frond. The men who passed through here had been none too careful. They probably assumed I'd die in the wreckage. The muddy footprints guided me deeper, up a slight slope, weaving between colossal tree trunks thick with strangler figs. The jungle's gloom intensified as the canopy overhead knit tighter, blotting out the dying light. Even afternoon here felt like dusk. A riot of sound assaulted my ears, cicadas shrilling, distant bird calls, the rush of unseen water. Occasionally, a branch creaked overhead, making me tense for the possibility of a big cat or some other lurking predator. My mind flicked back to that monstrous creature I'd killed. Were more out here? I had no illusions that I could survive another encounter like that. Eventually, the land dipped again, leading me to a meandering creek. My pulse leapt at the sight of water, but I remember the last time I bent down to drink from an unknown source in the plains vicinity. Here, though, the water looked clearer. I decided to risk it, crouching on trembling legs to fill my battered metal container. As I did, I heard a muffled shout. My entire body froze. There it was again, a voice carried on the thick air, somewhere ahead along the creek. Could it be the scavengers? Or someone else? The sound made my heart pound so hard it threatened to crack my ribs. Crouching low, I inched forward, using the wide buttress roots for cover. The creek curved around a cluster of boulders, revealing a spot of flatter terrain. I spotted a faint glow through the trees, firelight. My stomach lurched with equal parts dread and excitement. If they had a camp, they might also have more supplies, maybe medicine. Or they might just kill me on sight. Determined, I crept closer, ignoring the agony in my ankle. The voices grew clearer, harsh, guttural tones, occasionally spiked with laughter. Then I saw them, 3 men near a small fire, one smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. My stolen transmitter sat on a log, the flare tube scattered. They seemed to be fiddling with it, cursing when it beeped or hissed static. With them was a battered old pickup truck partially hidden by foliage, its tires caked in mud. My heart soared for a moment. If that vehicle worked, it was a ticket out. But how far could it go in this uncharted jungle? Possibly they had an off-road route or a hidden track. If I got my hands on it. My thoughts were interrupted by a yelp from beyond the fire. Another figure emerged, a scrawny teenager, face bruised, wearing clothes caked in grime. One of the men barked orders, and the kid hurried over to stoke the fire. The bandits, if that's what they were, laughed as one rummaged through a battered duffel bag. I glimpsed the butt of a pistol protruding from his waistband. Another had the rifle slung across his back. Machetes were everywhere. I pressed against the root, adrenaline flooding me. Confronting them alone was suicide. But if I waited for them to move, I might lose track of the transmitter and the truck. I needed to be smart. A half-formed plan took shape: wait for night to deepen, slip in quietly, grab what I could. But I was in no condition for stealth, especially with this limp. I might need a distraction. If I could start a fire somewhere else, or create some commotion. Suddenly, a woman's scream cut through the camp. My blood chilled. It wasn't just men and one teenage boy here. A woman was behind a large canvas sheet or tarp strung between 2 trees, forming a crude shelter. The scream wavered, then collapsed into a fit of coughing. The men snickered among themselves. Every hair on my neck stood on end. My heart hammered with both fury and fear. These people were more than opportunistic looters, they were captors, possibly worse. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. In my past life, I'd never considered violence except in self-defense. But the rules were different out here. These were not innocents. I crept around the perimeter, straining for more details. I counted 5 men total, 3 by the fire, 1 rummaging in the truck bed, 1 pacing with a machete near the makeshift shelter. The woman inside kept sobbing. The teenager seemed separate, cowering slightly away from them, possibly forced to serve them. My gaze locked on the transmitter, lying near the logs. One man kept prodding it with the butt of a knife as if trying to figure out how it worked. He spat in frustration, then set it aside. The second man rummaged through a cooler, pulling out a beer can, handing it around. They were relaxed, not expecting an attack. A glimmer of opportunity. But I needed a distraction big enough to draw them away. My eyes flicked to the truck. If I could slip in, start the ignition, maybe they'd chase me, leaving the campsite unguarded. But that was risky. I didn't know how to hotwire anything, or if the keys were in it. Then I noticed jerry cans stacked beside the truck, fuel. Enough to keep a camp generator or the truck running, or perhaps for trading. A savage idea sparked in my feverish mind: if I set one of those ablaze, the chaos might give me a chance to grab the transmitter, help the captive if possible, and vanish. Yes, but the thought of igniting that much fuel was terrifying. One spark too close, and I could blow us all sky high. Alternatively, I could slip up behind the truck with my lighter, tip a can to create a trail, then light it. Swallowing hard, I slid back into the jungle gloom. The men's chatter continued, occasionally punctuated by the woman's muffled sob. I circled wide, coming around behind the truck. My approach took me through tangles of vines that snagged my ankles, trying to trip me. Once, I nearly fell face first, a jolt of searing pain flaring in my side. I stifled a grunt, tasting blood in my mouth as I bit my lip. Closer now. The truck's rust-streaked tailgate was just a few steps away. I could smell gasoline, hear the men laughing. I flattened myself behind a cluster of broad leaves, glancing around. The man at the truck bed was rummaging through crates. I heard bottles clink, maybe stolen goods from the plane or from local villages. After a minute, he wandered off to join the others at the fire. This was my chance. I crawled forward, ignoring the protest of my battered body. My hand found one jerry can, feeling sticky residue on the nozzle. It was full, or close to it. My pulse raced. This was insane. One slip, and I'd turn into a torch. But I had no illusions about taking on 5 armed men alone. Slowly, I cracked the vent cap open, letting a trickle of fuel leak onto the ground. The reek intensified, stinging my nostrils. Using my knife, I cut a small strip from the ragged hem of my shirt and wedged it into the gap, forming a makeshift wick. My hand shook uncontrollably, either from fever or raw terror. If I lit it now, the can might explode too soon. I needed some distance. So I let the gas trickle in a line outward, inching away with the can. When I had a trail about 10 feet long, I carefully set the can down behind a bush, still oozing fuel. My heart pounded like a drum in my ears.